Hello, so this is our last set of notes for Unit 4, and actually coincidentally for botany. We're wrapping things up. This set of notes will go in your lecture notebook behind the last set of notes we did for Unit 4. Don't forget to keep audio on. Make sure that you are writing down stuff that if there are any examples or things like that that are not written on the slides but are helpful, then add those on. And then also don't forget that you need to get this set of notes stamped. We're getting close to the end of this unit, so notebook checks are coming at the end of the week, so make sure you do have this stamped already, okay? And then, of course, if you have any questions, feel free to pause this video at any time if you have a question, if something doesn't make sense, and I can go over it with you. Okay, raise your hand and I can go over to you. All right, let's get started. So, since plants are living organisms, remember that all living organisms, one of their characteristics of life is that they respond to their environment, and plants are no exception. They may not respond as quickly as animals do, but they still have this ability to very effectively respond to external stimuli. And so one of these responses is something called tropism. That's actually a major one. And tropism is basically when a plant will make some kind of change to the pattern or direction of its growth in response to its environment. And there are a bunch of different ones that are out there, but a lot of times the three main types of tropism, or the three big categories, are as follows. There's gravitropism, phototropism, and thigmotropism. And you can kind of tell a little bit from the prefixes what they're in response to, but we'll go through each of them here. Okay, so gravitropism, from the front part of that gravit, you get an idea. It has that's when plants have a tendency to grow in a direction in response to the pull of gravity. So remember, gravity is the force of pulling things towards the center of the earth. And so it's this force that actually enables a plant to grow in such a direction that roots always grow downwards and shoots always grow upwards. Even to the point where if you were to take a plant and turn it on its side like this, and give it enough time, eventually that plant is going to alter its growth pattern to have shoots and stems grow upward still. So that's what's causing this bend in the plant. And even though we can't really see it here, if we allowed its roots, or if we had a plant that had more like a tap root, allowed those roots to grow from the underside of this pot, it would actually end up going downwards as well. Okay, so that actually is the same thing that's responsible for, like, if you were to take a lily bulb, or some kind of tuber and plant it in the ground upside down. Normally there's like a root, kind of a part that has like roots, hair-like roots. If you were to plant it upside down and give it enough time, eventually those roots are going to start to grow downwards and the shoots are going to start to grow upwards again. So that's what gravitropism is. There's also phototropism, and if you remember, photo means light. So this is the tendency of plants to alter their growing pattern so that they're oriented towards the source of light. So if you've ever had seedlings on a windowsill like this, like you see here, or a plant sitting to the side of, let's say, an open window, right beside an open window, those plants tend to turn themselves so that their leaves are facing the sun. That makes sense because obviously that source of light is necessary for photosynthesis. So it's done for the plant's benefit to allow that plant to get the most sunlight. Same thing with gravitropism. Now that I think about it, it's the same sort of idea. It's the leaves grow upwards so that they're oriented towards the sun for photosynthesis. In any case, sorry, I forgot to mention that earlier. But that's what phototropism is, and that's actually why it's important, if you're growing plants near a window or something like that, that every so often you rotate that plant so that it doesn't end up being a lopsided plant. If you rotate the plant, it'll make sure to grow straight. Okay, thigmotropism. The prefix thigmo, I believe it's Greek. It's meant to be touched. So this is a plant's response to being in physical contact with something. And some examples would be like if you have a plant that's growing um, up against something, let's say a wall or a window. It could actually, if the leaves or the stems are in contact with that physical wall or window, it can actually over time stunt growth of that plant on that side. And so it's actually a you know, there. It's actually a good idea if you have plants in the house or things like that, or you're planting plants in the yard, that you make sure that they're not up against something like a rock or a wall. Um, Also, if we look at certain plants that have climbing abilities, vines, or ivy, or even vegetables like beans or cucumbers, they send out little climbers, little stems that have this ability to grasp around things like poles and fences. Um, the physical contact with poles, fences, things like that, allow these plants vines to wrap around. And again, that's meant to allow um, the plant to it's for the plant's benefit, so it can climb higher, maybe out of the shade of other plants that would prevent it from getting as much sunlight. It's just a way for that plant to have a better access to the light source. Okay, now there are plants out there that do have responses to their external environment, but it has nothing to do with growth. And if it doesn't involve growth, it's not considered a tropism. So just kind of keep in mind, there's not that many of them, but there are some. A good example would be like the mimosa plant. If you've ever come in contact with a mimosa plant or seen one before, it's sometimes called the sensitive plant because it has this ability. If you were to brush up against the plant, wherever you brushed up against, the leaves have this very dramatic reaction, and they actually shut close. So this is actually the same branch before it's been touched and then after it's been touched, and it's a defense mechanism. The explanation behind why it happens is not really necessary for you to memorize or anything, but just know that this response has nothing to do with um, like the plant isn't growing differently in any way. So it's not a tropism. It's just a rapid response. Another example would be like the Venus flytrap. So if we know when a fly falls into the a certain part lands in a certain part of the plant, it causes it to snap shut. We actually talk about Venus flytraps a little later on in these notes, but again, it doesn't really have anything to do with changing the growth pattern of that plant, so it's not really a tropism. It's just a rapid response. Okay, photoperiodism is another response that plants have to their environment, and this is just a plant's ability to respond to the amount of light and dark that it experiences in a 24-hour period. Okay, and this photoperiodism response is actually really a big deal when it comes to the way we categorize plants according to seasons. So we have some plants that are considered more fall and winter type plants, and we have plants that are considered more spring and summer. And the reason for that is because of their photoperiodism, this response that they have. And one of the main things that cause this is a pigment that plants have called phytochrome. And this phytochrome absorbs red wavelength light. And it actually, I mean, we don't get into too much detail with it, but it has to do with the type of light um, that's the amount of this red wavelength light that's absorbed in a 24-hour period. And it ends up, since certain times of the year have more sunlight than other times of the year, we end up with this kind of two category group of plants. According to photoperiodism. So these are the two categories. There's short day plants, and then there are long day plants. And it's pretty obvious they're named because of whether it's a short day or a long day. So short day plants are plants that tend to bloom when in the times of the year where the daylight is shorter. Okay, so if you think about the times of the year where it seems to get darker, it gets darker a lot faster in the day, kind of like right now where it gets really dark by 5 o'clock or 5:30. This is the time of year where short day plants are blooming. Okay, sometimes they're called long night plants. That's just the opposite of short day. These are the terms that we're going to use and that you're going to see on something like a test or quiz. But short day plants are also what we associate with fall and winter. So chrysanthemums are very common in the fall. They bloom in the fall time of year. Poinsettias, that's a Christmas flower for a good reason. These are associated with those times of the year because they bloom during those times of the year. Long day plants, just the opposite. So these are plants that flower when we have days that have very long periods of light. Okay, so in the spring and in the summer, flowers like irises and tulips, these are commonly associated with spring and summer for that very reason. They tend to bloom during those times of the year because they are long day plants, also known as short night plants. Okay, now you're going to see a diagram similar to this in the textbook. It's on page 641. Don't worry so much about night interrupted. It gets a little bit kind of crazy with those. We don't really, it's not that every plant falls into one of these two categories, but most of the plants do. Night interrupted, you don't worry about that. Okay, so here's early summer. In the early summer where we have most of the time of the day is light. Okay, that's what's indicated with the yellow there. So that's when long day plants bloom. So like this bearded iris. Short day plants tend to bloom during the times of the year where there's only a little bit of light. Okay, so these would be like poinsettias. Okay, now another response that you're going to see talked about in the textbook is something called dormancy. And dormancy, it says winter dormancy, you could also just call it dormancy, is a period of time where a plant actually goes into this kind of inactive state. So it's a decrease in an organism's growth and activity patterns. Sometimes it's even a stop in their growth and activity patterns altogether. But it's this time where the plant almost just stops being so active with its photosynthesis and so on. And so it tends to be triggered by temperature. So as cold weather starts coming, things start, the daytime starts getting more cold. A couple of these changes start to happen. And they happen mostly in deciduous plants. So if you don't know what deciduous means, it just means plants that shed their leaves. So if you think of in the fall, in the autumn, where there are certain plants that tend to lose their leaves, they're what we call deciduous. And so there are a few things that happen, a few changes that happen in these plants. One is the amount of photosynthesis that they do drastically decreases. So they turn off certain pathways. And so their leaves are just not doing as much of that photosynthesis. Okay, not only that, but they actually take a lot of the sugars that are stored in their leaves. Those materials start getting pumped actively down to the roots from the leaves and to act almost like a storage. Okay, so storing a lot of those nutrients for this cold weather that's coming. And then to prevent things like water loss, a lot of deciduous leaves end up sealing off, deciduous plants end up sealing off their leaves from the rest of the plant. So remember how transpiration can happen from the leaves as the plant is going through photosynthesis and so on. That water can evaporate from the leaf surface through the stoma. Well, that becomes a weak point for plants that are trying to conserve water. So the best thing to do is to basically prevent that leaf from losing that precious water that needs to be stored, that could make that plant dry out. So that's what a lot of deciduous plants do. And so this tends to be the last thing that happens when a plant is getting ready for the winter. But we call this leaf abscission. Okay, and it's in a response specifically to that stress. Now, in cold weather, the stress is that the temperature is decreasing, but plants even have this ability to abscise their leaves even when they are stressed out, which is why if you have a plant that's not doing so well in the house, let's say maybe not getting as much nitrogen or whatever, one of the ways you can tell it's not doing so hot is if it starts to drop its leaves. It's for the same reason. It's getting some environmental stress and it needs a bit of help. Okay, but what ends up happening is, and there we go. So it's most commonly due to cold, like leaves when they drop in autumn. But what the way that this works is right at the base of the leaf, at the where this petiole, this little stem is. There's something called an abscission layer. It's this layer of specialized cells that have this ability to um, basically seal off this what will be an an open spot in the stem if this leaf falls off. So the abscission layer actually has this ability to kind of seal that off so that this leaf can fall off cleanly. And usually, when those leaves fall, that's an indication that everything has been done. That leaf is no longer needed for photosynthesis. Eventually, next year, this bud will grow into a new one anyway. But that's what abscission is. Okay. Um, and that'll just prevent that water for loss from happening anymore now that it's been sealed off. Okay, so that's it in terms of responses. Let's look at adaptations. So one of the benefits of angiosperms is that they grow in a wide variety of environments of ecosystems. And the reason they do this is because angiosperms come in all shapes and sizes. They have lots of different evolved tolerances, adaptations, characteristics that allow them to do well in just a wide range of situations. And some of these adaptations relate to things like the amount of water available. So there are some parts of the world where there's lots of water, some parts where it's very dry. Plants are adapted to both those conditions. Soil quality, so how much dissolved important nutrients are found in the soil they grow in, and even predators and consumers. So bugs, insects, animals that might eat these plants. A lot of plants have evolved adaptations to help them either fight back in some cases or at least kind of minimize the amount of predation that affects them. Okay, so here's a great example, aquatic plants. Now, plants do need water, but the problem is if you have a plant completely submerged in water, like if I took my house plant from my house and put it in the bathtub and filled the bathtub to the brim, eventually that plant, because it's not adapted to that environment, would essentially drown. The leaves are not able to get oxygen because they're surrounded by water, and that plant would just not do very well. Okay, now aquatic plants, however, are adapted to do just fine in those conditions. And the way they do that is, like, for example, this water lily, this is a cross section of a water lily stem. You can see that there are lots of air filled pockets, okay, in the stems and in some cases in the leaves, and that allows for oxygen to travel within the plant and get to the cells that need that oxygen. And so that's just an adaptation that aquatic plants have. It also, because of these air spaces, is what's responsible for a lot of plants being parts of plants being very buoyant. Like, for example, lily pads. Okay, because there's almost like these little air pocket life vests kind of things that allow for floating of leaves and things on the surface of the water. Okay, another adaptation is there are certain plants that live in areas where there's a lot of salt. Now, salt normally, if you were to take like salt and sprinkle it in a garden, that's a really good way to kill a garden because salt will draw moisture out of living tissue, and that's not good for a plant, right? So normally salt is a bad thing, but there are some plants that are adapted to grow in areas where salt is found in abundance. So especially in areas like marshes or mangroves where salt water floods in from the ocean, the plants that live there have this ability to pump salt out of their tissues. And so that salt would normally kill them, but they have this ability to actively pump that salt out and keep them alive, and they thrive in those conditions. So this is a mangrove plant, mangrove trees, and their roots regularly get flushed with salt water coming in from the ocean, and they have this ability to prevent themselves from drying out. They have this adaptation. Okay, desert plants, great example of adaptations. Desert plants are also known as xerophytes. Okay, so they need to tolerate an extreme range of conditions, and we experience these here. A lot of our plants are xerophytes here in the desert. They need to protect themselves from things like strong winds, daytime heat, even the soil quality. There's a lot of sandy soil in areas in the desert, infrequent rain, infrequent precipitation. So a lot of the plants here in the desert have a lot of the same adaptations. They all, a lot of them look very similar to one another. So let's go through a few of these here. One thing is roots tend to be very widespread. Well, they're adapted to be able to absorb as much water in as little time as possible. So this saguaro cactus, for example, if I were to dig below the surface, I'd find its roots are actually very widespread, much wider than the plant itself. And that's because you end up with a large surface area that when rain hits the ground, there's a lot of root surface that can absorb that water. Another thing as well that I don't have on here is a lot of times those roots don't go very deep. So they stay very close to the surface, and that makes sense. If we were to get rain here and it's really warm, the sun will evaporate that water very quickly. So that a lot of that water doesn't make it really, really deep into the ground. So that makes sense that the roots a lot of time are very shallow. They're very close to the surface, where the water tends to be before it evaporates. Okay, even when it comes to leaves, if you look at the trees out in the courtyard or even in your back or front yard, you'll find that it's very rare down in the hot desert part of Arizona to find trees that have very large leaves. Large leaves means more surface area. That means more water loss to evaporation, transpiration. So having very small leaves prevents that from happening. Okay, and then things like cacti or even not cacti. There are a lot of plants in the desert areas that have very big stems, very large trunks. Cacti are like an extreme example of that. But these large trunks and stems are meant to store water. In fact, after a rain, if you were to cut into a cactus, you would see that it holds a lot of moisture, a lot of jelly-like watery substance, and that's ground tissue, and that's all holding water for the plant to use later on. Okay, and then lastly, a lot of xerophytes have this waxy kind of surface to them. So a cactus, between the needles, you can find that it's very thick and kind of waxy like, and that cuticle is thicker, again, to prevent extra water from being lost by that plant. Okay, so those are some examples. Another adaptation that plants have has to do with their soil quality. So there are some plants that their soil may be lacking in some of the essential nutrients, things like nitrogen or phosphorus. A lot of plants are adapted to be able to supplement that. So similar to like when you take, if you take a vitamin to supplement your diet, same sort of idea. There are some plants that are nutritional specialists and can supplement the soil that they grow in. Okay, so here's an example. Carnivorous plants, they tend to grow in environments that have nitrogen poor soil, so not a lot of nitrogen. And so what they do is to supplement that is they get their nitrogen instead by not only photosynthesis is used to get their food, but they also supplement by digesting prey. So flies, spiders, beetles, things like that. They lure them into their specialized leaves and actually catch them and dissolve them, break them down to get the nutrients from the tissues of those insects. Another example would be parasites. Mistletoe, one of those symbols of Christmas, kind of puts a damper on it, but they are actually parasites. So that kind of stinks. But anyway, parasites are sadly they benefit by harming other plants. So mistletoe, for example, um, grows in order to get some of its missing nutrients, ends up getting those by growing things that are similar to roots, kind of embedding them into another plant, like this tree here, and getting their nutrients that way, okay, from a host plant. Now, I don't want to confuse this with epiphytes, and I apologize, I don't have a separate slide for epiphytes, so you might need to jot this in. But epiphytes are plants that are not rooted in soil, but grow directly on top of other plants. Okay, so I don't want you to think that epiphytes are parasites, though. They're not. They're not actually harming the plant that they attach themselves to. It's more like they're benefiting from that plant. Either helping that plant out in a mutual relationship, mutualistic, or in some cases commensalism, just it benefits but the plant isn't harmed in any way. Okay, so they gather their own moisture. A lot of times they gather it from the air, from an external environment, um, but they're not really parasites, so don't confuse the two. Okay, lastly, we're finally here. Lastly, chemical defenses. So there are a lot of plants that defend themselves from predators. So insects obviously are a big problem. They can eat plant tissue a lot of the time, but there are some animals as well that can eat them. And so plants often try to defend themselves by making certain chemicals that can have effect on animals. So, for example, poisons or toxins. Some plants make them in the hopes of preventing predators from eating them. It doesn't always work though. For example, this is a monarch caterpillar that eats milkweed, and milkweed is normally poisonous. It is poisonous, I shouldn't say normally, and so certain animals won't eat it. But then again, you have some insects that are adapted to do just fine. They adapt as well to be able to tolerate the poisons or toxins that are in their favorite plants. Um, some plants even produce chemicals similar to insect hormones that might affect their growth patterns or their reproduction patterns as well. So there's a wide variety of them. We may talk about some of these things more when we get into zoology next semester, but just know that plants have this ability to also use chemical defenses too as an adaptation. Okay, and that is it. Thanks.